with the marketing side of me. So because it's the COVID-19 crisis, I try to start every action with a C. I just couldn't help myself. Uh, and the first and most important one is communication. And with communication here, we have a responsibility to, when in doubt, over communicate with clarity and transparency to all of our stakeholders, and above all, not to sugarcoat the situation. There are going to be a lot of great success stories to talk about here, but we can't sugarcoat the reality of our situation, not with our employees, not with our customers, not with our fellow resellers who are definitely in the same boat with us, and certainly not with investors and suppliers. I think that credibility and trust will come from over communicating. So communication is the first bold action, because we have never before been called to communicate at the level that we have to communicate now. And it doesn't always come naturally. So reach deeper inside yourself. The second is continuity. In times like this, we have to make sure on a daily basis that our team is safe, first and foremost, and they were not put in harm's way for any kind of business expediency. And yet, in some instances, as we're finding, 3D printing is becoming very, very essential to fighting the pandemic and for continuity of life. So we need to balance team safety and continuity and the needs of the business. And we need to come up with contingencies. You know, continuity means that we, on a daily basis, figure out all of the contingencies from a doomsday scenario to a bright future scenario and everything in between. The third is cash. And I mentioned cash previously, but I want to kind of double click on it a little bit here. Cash is king in any season. It's absolutely critical to survival, which means every company is going to have to make cash preservation decisions. And it's going to split between companies that need investment because they're in early stage, and early stage companies will absolutely have to adjust the runway and adjust their spending. This is not a period in which business will continue as usual. We don't know if this is a 3-month disruption, a 6-month disruption, or longer. And with what we know today, we have to conserve cash. Larger companies need to know on a daily basis where their break-even point is so that they can really adjust for that. And that means we're also going to be in an environment in which it will be much harsher to raise and harder to raise venture capital. It's going to be harder for a period of time to access credit if you don't already have it. And while the stimulus package is coming, governments, central governments, and our federal government are not well known for agile execution. So before we feel it, it's going to take time. The fourth action is change. And the first thing that I would recommend to everybody is, if you haven't done it already, throw away your 2020 plans, because now is the time to assess the reality of your situation and prepare for the worst and best case scenarios. And you know what? The companies that will be the most adaptable in a period like this will really be the companies that will be able to not only survive but thrive on the other side. There are significant opportunities in this period to reinvent business models and go to market. And yes, for additive manufacturing, COVID-19, may prove to be the kind of growth catalyst that finally takes us into the mainstream, because I think that to a large extent, there are two very interesting themes that are already emerging for us as an industry. One is that there's going to be a massive supply chain disruption, and the way that companies and organizations will look at what's my cost per part will be calculated very differently, because you know what, when you don't have parts for 30 or 60 or 90 days, you begin to look at how you compute cost per part very differently. And the other is design agility. I think that our entire industry is already shining through by the agility and resiliency and inventiveness that 3D printing can bring to any problem. And I think that that will come through into the recovery phase. So there are real opportunities here also to redefine the whole industry's value proposition around supply chain disruption and design agility. And it's also a time to reposition your own company in terms of resources and channels and go to market. We're not going to go back to the old normal after this. We're going to be into a new paradigm, into a new normal in which increased virtual and digital components in the business model, from how we deliver content, how we do demos, how we communicate, how we provide customer success and applications, will all evolve and change. And while this pandemic will pass, the crisis will pass, the lessons will probably stay with us for the rest of our lives. And I'll say another thing, not everybody, unfortunately, is going to make it in good shape out of this crisis. So if there has ever been an opportunity to collaborate more and to seek some uncommon partnerships, to gain access to anything that you need in your business, this is really, there's never been a better time to find some uncommon partners that you may have not considered in the past. And finally, the fifth one, Sarah, is courage. And courage is the courage to lead, the courage to be in reality and not in denial, the courage to act with agility and boldness, and the clarity of mind to be in consultation with your internal team and your external community so that you can take the right actions across the board for your employees, your customers and investors, for the preservation of your business, to ask for help and lean on your board and community because nobody expects you to have all the answers, and to practice honesty and transparency even when it's inconvenient, even when it's tough. So,
perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Avi, you actually touched on a couple of the questions people have been submitting in there. So I want to just kind of take a second to dig into a little bit of those. For your advice from a leader to the people, who are working out there and the reaction that leadership is having. Two questions here go really nicely hand in hand. Sarah asked, how does one keep their sanity? She says, I'm getting at least 100 emails per hour about building new devices in order to effectively lead. My brain is taxed and I'm an excellent multitasker with so much happening. And then Yulia says, what is your advice for those leaders who haven't trusted people with remote work but are now forced to deal with it? How can they build trust?
Yeah, well, let's take it one at a time. Sarah, I hear you, and you and I think, corresponded yesterday about the hundreds of emails that we're getting. One keeps sanity here by collaborating, by talking and reasoning things out. and also by making sure that in this physical isolation we stay connected with ourselves, with our well-being. It's a pretty good idea to take some walks if you can, without violating any social distancing, and to get out of your head a little bit and be in your body, and exercise a little bit or meditate, if you can do it. These are kind of old cliched pieces of advice, but they really work, particularly in tough times. But I think that Sarah is also asking a question about not just sanity, but about how do we make sure that we become a collaborative, effective, and productive force multiplier as a community? And there, I think that we have an opportunity to coalesce and convene and curate maybe a more effective allocation and use of our resources, because we're all getting the same questions every day. Can you help me in my local community with some protective masks and protective gear? And I think we've seen some tremendous examples of designs, that can make that happen, from Perusa and from other companies that uh, we ought to figure out how to scale, right, and coordinate. Ventilators. I must have gotten 2 dozen incoming requests in the last week and a half, about all the way from producing compact ventilators by 3D printing to producing valves and splitters. And again, if there was a way for us to quickly figure out, as a result of this conversation, how do we begin to organize ourselves into a scalable and impactful force, not into a group of individuals, but kind of harnessing the collective power and capacity and intellect that we have to execute. I think we can be more productive, and maybe then we'll get fewer emails. I don't know. Can you remind me of the second question?
Of course. What is your advice for those leaders who haven't trusted people with remote work but are now forced to deal with it? How can they build that trust?
Well, I think that my advice to leaders that don't trust remote work is to get with it, get real, in the sense that I don't think at the end of this we're coming back to the same office environment or facility environment. I think that we're blessed that we have all this connectivity, and we live in a period in which Zoom is fast becoming a verb. But to me, this is informing and shaping and acting as a catalyst for the future of work. And the future of work is going to be based heavily on telepresence technologies, on mixed reality between augmented and real. It's going to be based on much more collaboration with technologies like AI. And on the one hand, we're blessed that we have all this connectivity already, and it's been around for a while, but not fully embraced, or else we couldn't be having this conversation right now. But in my mind, we're not going back. We're going to push forward. And one of the gifts, if there is such a thing, out of this horrible pandemic, is that we will be forced to embrace it, and it will become a new friend. And our conversations in the future will be shaped and informed by it, because not only is it going to leap us forward in a positive way, there's going to be a lot of trauma that we're going to take with us on the other side of it. And also we need to be prepared. Part of continuity is this may reoccur COVID-19 may reoccur before the end of this year, as we get into the winter of 2020, because we're not yet close enough to a vaccine. And I can imagine that just because of what we are going through organizationally, every time when there is a little hiccup, we will immediately default to the same operating mode as we are today. So part of continuity is, and part of being in reality is understanding that not only may we not go back to work by Easter, but we might have a reoccurrence of this in some fashion by Halloween time. I'm not wishing it on anybody, but we need to be prepared.
Absolutely. And that takes us to the next area you had planned, Avi, to discuss about proactive leadership strategies. When we're looking at what people can really do to be proactive, to drive transformation and sustainable solutions. So when we look at strategic shifts during crisis, do you see that they often lead to sustained changes in strategy when business is back to normal, whatever that new normal is?
Well, I really believe that, and this is another one of those old adages that necessity is the mother of invention, and that in times like this, our real purpose and mission as a business and as individuals typically kind of comes into greater focus, and it often provide us with the clarity for a next phase of growth. So for example, for me, in the 2008 2009 recession, what became obvious is that 3D Systems could not have continued and survived absent some augmentation of activities, and that we would not have made it just on selling printers and materials during that period. And that's when we began to develop the whole on-demand parts business, the acquisition of some service bureaus, which proved to be very successful and kind of saw the company through a very tough period and propelled it forward, and in essence triggered kind of an industry following by Stratasys and others that discovered that this was a pretty meaningful way to expand. The other big, if you will, strategic insight that I got from the 08, 09 recession was that there was a real opportunity for 3D Systems to firmly enter into the whole healthcare side of the business, which in hindsight became one of the fastest growing and the most successful parts of 3D Systems for the next few years. And in fact, when you look back at the period from 09 to about 2014, the company came out and really realized its prime growth and performance immediately in the periods following the 08 and 09 recession, which tells me that some of the best growth strategies in repositioning and go-to-market can be born out of a period like this, because it really forces leaders to look at everything. For me today, what I'm doing in my companies is I'm looking at everything. How are we going to market? What kind of different tools and technology can we use to reach customers in a more meaningful and intimate way and service them better? what kind of technology can we take out of this crisis and put in the hands of our reseller community so that they can become more productive and more effective? How do we begin to, as an industry, redefine the narrative of our value proposition? I kind of touched on that a little bit when I said really it's all about design agility and supply chain disruption. And yes, we're going to have, I mean, for those of us who have meaningful uh, healthcare businesses that come out of this, and I'm not talking just about protective gear because that I look at that as a temporary, meaningful stopgap, but not a long-term business model. But for those of us who have opportunities to really plug into some of the pivots that are going to happen in supply chain as a result of it, and all of the government contracts that will come out of it, and all of the repurposing of some factories. I mean, we read every day now about partnerships last night between GM and Ford and others to help with ventilators. Elon Musk jumping into it, and